Welcome to the Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. I'm joined by Dr. Klaas Kraay to discuss the problem of no best world. He's going to walk us through what the problem is and then some potential responses to it. So, welcome, Dr. Kraay.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here yet again.
I'm so excited every time you come on, and this one's going to be a really good interview. I really appreciate you discussing this with me.
Well, thanks.
So,
It's a fascinating and challenging argument, and I think an argument that hasn't really gotten its due. So I'm excited to lay it out for your viewers and listeners.
perfect. All right. Well, you've put together some slides, and we're just going to walk through these one at a time. So, in order to understand the problem of no best world, we need some terminology to be defined. So, why don't you lay out these terms in the argument?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So obviously, people use the word God in all sorts of different ways, right? And there are lots of different conceptions of who or what God is. But the understanding that I'm going to be working with is a pretty traditional one, and it's roughly this: a personal being who is unsurpassable in power and knowledge and goodness, who is the ultimate creator of everything that exists, or at least everything that exists contingently, who has a nature that's essentially fixed and who exists necessarily. In other words, who exists in every logically possible world. Every part of that definition of God is controversial, but it's nevertheless an important and influential one, and one that is in the background for this problem.
All right. So, that's God. What about actual world versus possible world?
Yeah, and this may be familiar to a lot of the people listening or watching, but here's the idea, and I'll do this sort of roughly and not too technically. So think of the actual world as all of reality, the way things actually are, everything that existed in the past and that exists now and that will exist in the future, all of that stuff that's, to put it really loosely, that's really real, right? That's the actual world. But of course, as we all know, things could have been different, right? I could have worn a red shirt instead of a blue shirt, and you could have had a pink microphone instead of a black microphone, and millions of other things like that. And each one of these scenarios, philosophers say, is a different possible world. So there's a different possible world, an alternative state of affairs, perhaps, in which everything else is more or less the same, but I wore a red shirt instead of a blue shirt, and so on, right? Different histories, different present, different future. There are innumerable different possibilities, different ways that things might have been that are different from the actual world. So that's what I mean by possible worlds.
Perfect. Okay. One more distinction, and then we can begin looking at this argument.
Yeah.
What is the distinction between God creating a world versus God actualizing a world?
Yeah, so here I have to get just a little bit more technical, right? So in my definition of God earlier, I said that, God is the creator and sustainer of all that is, right? So that's the more familiar idea, I think, right? So God decides to create a planet or a person or a rock or a tree or something like that, right? That's creation. And then there's this traditional idea that God not only creates, but sustains things in existence, right? That's pretty familiar as well. You might have heard, or your listeners will have heard, I'm sure, of the idea of creation ex nihilo, right? That God creates out of nothing. That's the idea of creation. Okay. Now, actualizing is a little bit more arcane or a little bit more complex, right? So here's what I mean by actualizing. So God does certain things or refrains from doing certain things, and whatever God does or refrains from doing helps to make the world the way it is, as opposed to a different way. Right, so maybe God brings about a flood, but God might not have brought about a flood. So that means there's a possible world in which God didn't bring about a flood, and so forth. Right. So to say that God actualizes a world, actualizing here just refers to the sum total of God's actions and God's refrainings that help to make the world what it is. Now, that might sound an awful lot like creating, but there's a difference, right? So suppose that God doesn't create anything. So there's no earth, there's no rocks, planets, stars, people, whatever, right? There's still an actual world, right? Theists want to say that God still exists, even if the world doesn't, even if the earth doesn't, let's say. So then there would still be an actual world, but there would be no creation. So God, by choosing not to make anything, has actualized the world that includes, let's say, just God. Maybe it doesn't contain just God, maybe it contains God and numbers. We can get into the technical details there, but the idea is that there's a distinction between actualizing and creating. Now, a couple of quick points about actualizing before we move on. A lot of this discussion is going to be about God choosing which world to actualize. And that can be a little misleading. It can make it sound as though God stands outside of all these possible worlds and surveys them all and says that one's going to be. That's a little bit misleading. I mean, we are going to talk that way, but God, according to this notion of God, is inside every world. Right? So there's one world, let's say for our purposes, that's the actual world, right? So it's God's actions and refrainings that have made that the actual world as opposed to any other one. So it's not that there's some vantage point outside of all the possible worlds. God is inside all of them as a necessary being. That's the one point I wanted to make. The next point I wanted to make is that it can prompt the thought that God somehow determines every feature of the world all at once in 1 second from the beginning or something like that. Might go down like that, but it needn't, right? There's no part of the notion of actualizing that requires that. God might institute some random processes, or God might create creatures that have libertarian free will. And then part of what makes the world go one way rather than another is the way these processes unfold, or the way these creatures act, or so forth, right? So again, it's not that God has to decide every feature of the world all at once. God might, I suppose, do that, but that's not part of the notion of actualizing, right? In a way, you could even say that God would be collaborating with creatures in shaping which world is actual. If there are libertarian free creatures, for example, whose actions and omissions ensure that the world goes this way rather than that way, God's doing stuff, the creatures are doing stuff, and together that ensures that the world goes this way rather than that way, so to speak, right? God, of course, plays a more significant and important role than the actions of any creature on theism, of course. God is like the most important actualizer. But my point here is just that God's not sort of doing everything. God's not making every decision, right? Or doesn't have to be anyway. Yeah, so that's probably enough now to distinguish creation from actualizing. From here on in, I'll hardly use the word creating. I'll just refer to God actualizing a world, meaning the stuff that God does and refrains from doing that shapes which way reality unfolds.
Excellent. Okay. So now we're going to lead up to the problem by first thinking about this scenario where there's this one possible world that God actualizes, and it's the best possible world. So walk us through this scenario, what some objections are to it.
Yeah, good. So, and again, yeah, I like the way you set it up. It's exactly to build a contrast with the argument that we're really going to talk about in a minute. So here's the idea, right? I'm going to just assume that it makes sense to talk about the overall value of worlds, that you can say that one world is good and another world is bad, and that X world is better than Y world, and so forth, right? It's controversial, but it's widely assumed within philosophy of religion that you can talk about the overall status of worlds. Okay, so suppose, and it's a pretty traditional and familiar idea, suppose that there is a best of all possible worlds, okay? It's a pretty tempting thought, or certainly Leibniz's thought. It's a pretty tempting thought that if there is one best world, that's the one that God's going to pick, right? How could God pick anything else? It's the best, right? God is perfectly rational and perfectly benevolent and so forth. And the perfectly rational, perfectly benevolent agent is not going to pick anything other than the best, right? Okay, so suppose that's your model. Well, as you see on the slide here, there's a bunch of objections, right? If God, has to pick that world, then there are some concerns about whether God is really free, right? Could God really be free if God is unable to do other than pick the best of all possible worlds? And a lot of theists want to say that God's choice in actualizing the world is a free one, that God's choice of whether to create or not, for example, is free. So it might seem on this model that God can't be free. It's controversial, of course. There are models of God's freedom on which God doesn't require the power to do otherwise. But anyway, that's an objection. A related objection, as you can see there, is that, wait a minute, aren't theists supposed to thank God and praise God for bringing about the best of all possible worlds? But if God couldn't have done otherwise, does that really make sense to say that God is praiseworthy and thankworthy for doing this? I mean, God had no choice, right? So that's a related worry. Again, there are responses to it. An even deeper worry, I think, is this. If God had to do that, and God is, as I said, the primary world actualizer, so to speak, the most important agent that shapes whether a world goes one way or another. And if that agent was, bound to pick the best, the unique best, are the other ones really genuine possibilities anymore? I mean, maybe they're not. That's the thought here. That's the fancy term for this is modal collapse. But in other words, maybe all those other possibilities that sounded like they were genuine aren't genuine anymore. And then maybe it's even worse because maybe that means that nothing could be otherwise than it is, right? If we're in the best of all possible worlds and God had to pick that, and that involves, strangely enough, me wearing a blue shirt, it seems like there's no scenario anymore where I would have worn a red shirt, right? So the idea is that modal space, the space of possibilities, is shrinks to just one world. Nothing could be otherwise than it is, and that seems very strange, right? Well, of course, another response, so a totally different kind of response, is to say, wait a minute, your model of theism predicts that if God exists, God's going to pick the best of all possible worlds. But, famous objection, look around you, right? This isn't the best of all possible worlds. Things could be an awful lot better in any number of ways, right? So that's a range of objections that have been offered to this particular model of theism.
Excellent. Okay. Now, I'm thinking of your article that you put in this companion to the Philosophy of Religion book. I think it's edited by Draper and I forgot the other guy's name. Taliaferro.
Charles Tolliver, yeah.
So I'm interested in getting that book now. But I read your entry on this problem, the problem of no best world, and you mentioned these two responses. So walk us through these two responses.
Yeah, good. So the model that we've been talking about is there's a best of all possible world and God's gonna pick it, right? So one thing you could do is say, well, no, it's not some sort of requirement that God pick the best of all possible worlds. Maybe it's perfectly fine for an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly morally perfect, perfectly rational agent to pick a world other than the best. That's going to be controversial, of course, but that's one way to avoid these problems, right? It would avoid all four of these problems at a single stroke, right? But the biggest, most influential response to this, which is our jumping off point for the argument we're really going to talk about, is to say that this model rests on a mistake. The model that God looks around, identifies the best of all possible worlds, and makes that one, actualizes that one, is mistaken because there's no such thing. Just as there's no greatest positive integer, there's no best of all possible worlds. Instead, there's an infinite hierarchy of increasingly better worlds. And that avoids these issues as well, or so it seems.
That's going to lead us to our problem. So let's shift now from scenario 1, where there is a best possible world, to scenario 2, where there's no best possible world.
Right. So if you're a theist and you think to yourself, okay, I'm bothered by these objections on the one model, maybe I'm going to prefer this other model, the model according to which there's no best of all possible worlds. By the way, this is basically orthodoxy in analytic philosophy of religion circles. It's just about widely taken for granted that there's no such thing as the best of all possible worlds. Okay, but William Rowe and some other philosophers have argued that there's still a problem for theism on this model. So let me set it up. I'll do it first roughly, and then I'll do it sort of slightly more precisely. The rough idea is this. Think about this. What world is God going to pick if there's no best of all possible worlds? For any world that God picks, it seems like God could have picked a better one. And if God always could have picked a better one, then it seems like God could have done a better action. And if God could have performed a better action, then God could have been better. But of course, that's not supposed to be possible because on theism, as I defined it, God is supposed to be essentially unsurpassable. So there it is in a sentence and a half. Slightly more formally on the slide here, the idea is that you've got these four ideas and they just can't all be true. So NBW, the first one, is this idea that there's an infinite hierarchy of increasingly better worlds. Then you've got these two principles, which in the literature are sometimes run together, but I find it helpful to pull them apart. The first one, P1, you'll notice, links the goodness of the product of an action with the goodness of the action. So roughly, if it's possible for the product to be better, then all else equal, it's possible for the action to have been better. So in other words, God could have picked a better world, so God could have performed a better action. The next premise, P2, or the next proposition, P2, says, look, you've got a similar connection between the goodness of the action and the goodness of the actor or the agent. If it's possible for some action to have been better, morally speaking or rationally speaking, then all else equal, it's possible for that being to have been better. So first premise, the first claim here, P1, links the goodness of the product to the goodness of the action in a very weak sense. It doesn't say that the better the product, it's obviously always the case that the better the action, right? There's that ceteris paribus clause in there. The second principle here says the better the action, all else equal. If it's possible the action be better, then it's possible the agent have been better. And of course, then you've got G here. And G, by the way, is a super modest claim. It just says that it's possible that there's a perfect being, an essentially unsurpassable being. But that doesn't fit with these other claims. So you see the tension. One of these things has to go. So I think it's a fascinating argument, and I'll contrast it, if you like, in a minute to the problem of evil, which it's sometimes confused with.
Okay, so that was the problem of no best world. Now we want to walk through some responses. Before you do that, you wanted to contrast this with the problem of evil. So yeah, can you contrast these two problems?
Yeah, and I'll be brief here, right? I mean, the problem of evil, of course, is a bit of a misnomer. It's a kind of a loose name for a whole family of arguments that try to show that atheism is true one way or another, with some reference to evil, right? But I do want to stress how this is a different problem, right? So first of all, right, suppose there's no best world, then it doesn't make sense to demand that God make the best of all possible world. That's like telling God to pick the greatest positive integer. It's an unreasonable demand. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't run arguments from evil on this no best world model. You might say, fine, I think there's no best world. I think God just has to pick a really good one. But look around you. This world is far from really good. It's really quite bad. God should have done better, right? So you could still run some kind of argument from evil, even on this no best world model. But the main point I want to make on this slide is that these really are different problems, right? The problem of no best world is a priori, right? It just involves introspective reflection on the relevant concepts. It's not like you're looking out into the world and finding some a posteriori feature of the world that is in tension with theism in some sense or another. No, it's saying that, look, a priori reflection on these concepts shows that there's a self-contradiction here, right? Whereas arguments from evil always or almost always involve some sort of a posteriori premise about the existence of evil or the quantity of evil or the scope of evil or the distribution of evil or whatever, right? Arguments from evil usually say that feature out there in the world counts against theism. Problem of no best world doesn't do that. Most arguments from evil, secondly, conclude that God is not actual or that God is not probably not actual. The problem of no best world is much more ambitious. It tries to conclude that the thing you should kick out of that inconsistent set is the last claim, which of course says that God is possible. So really, it's an argument not just for the non-existence of God, but for the impossibility of God. So it's much more ambitious, right? And then just to make totally clear that this is a different problem, suppose that there's no evil in any possible world at all. There's no such thing as evil, right? You could still run this argument because this argument is an argument from improvability. It's basically saying, look, things always could have been better. Therefore, allegedly, God could have done better. Therefore, allegedly, God could have been better, right? That's the gist of the argument. And you could run that argument even if there's no evil whatsoever. So I think that's a good reason for thinking that it's a different kind of argument from various arguments from evil.
That's really interesting, the contrast there. So yeah, it seems like if the logical version of the problem of evil doesn't succeed, and many think it doesn't, you could still have that evidential problem of evil, fine, but then you could also have this distinct problem of no best world.
That's right.
That
That's
doesn't even
totally a
need for it to be
priori.
evil.
That's right. And it's in a way much more ambitious, right? So yeah, very, very interesting challenge to theism.
Okay, so now let's get into some of the responses. I think you're going to lay out, correct me if I'm wrong, 5 responses.
Yeah, 5 responses, and I'm not sure that any of them really succeeds. I want one or more of them to succeed, or a response to this argument to succeed. But my basic, just to sort of put my cards on the table, is I think that the main responses that have been urged in the literature are either not successful or not obviously successful, or at least in need of more defense, right? So I think this argument for atheism has an awful lot going for it. That's the sort of nutshell version of my speech on this. So yes, I want to look at 5 different responses, and the 5th one I've got sort of 3 different subversions of that. There's a pretty big literature on this, by the way, and I'm certainly not going to try to cover everything that's been said in the literature. I've written a bunch of papers on it if your listeners want to look at those, but I'm going to try to give your listeners or your viewers a sense for what the different kinds of moves are here, and try to give a bit of an accounting of what I think the pros and cons are. Okay, so the first one obviously is you could say, well, look, this problem only gets going if there's no best of all possible worlds. Maybe that's where we theists should get off the bus, right? Maybe we should say, you know what, that's a mistake. If that's the claim, you should kick out of this inconsistent set, right? So how could you do that, right? Well, I've got sort of a negative case and a positive case here. I think there's some interesting things to say here, right? So. The arguments that have been offered for the claim that there's no best of all possible worlds are actually pretty modest, right? They're pretty sketchy. They're pretty hasty in the literature. People say things like, well, look, you could always have a few more happy agents in the world. And so, of course, you could always add more agents. You know, it's not like God's going to run out of room. So there's no best of all possible worlds, right? The arguments are at about that level of superficiality. So you might say, well, I don't know, maybe these arguments aren't all that good. By the way, they seem to have persuaded most analytic philosophers of religion, but maybe that's the one sort of modest way you could push back. I want to put a plug in here for an underappreciated paper by Anders Kraay on this point, where he really goes through the existing arguments for the claim that there's no best of all possible worlds, and I think really takes them to task quite nicely. So that's sort of a negative move. You could say, look, all these people think there's no best of all possible worlds, but the arguments they offer for that aren't all that persuasive. Okay, or you could go more ambitious, more positive, and you could say, well, no, look, I'm going to try to argue that there is a best of all possible worlds. Now, maybe you can do that. Then maybe you're out of the frying pan and back into the fire that we talked about earlier, right? Because as I said, if there's one best of all possible worlds, there's still all these objections to theism that you've got to face, at least if you think that God must make the best of all possible worlds. In any case, obviously one move here is to say, I basically reject the ontological backdrop upon which this argument depends. I reject NBW. Okay, but NBW has some intuitions going for it, of course. So that brings me to the second response, right? Another way to do it is to kind of, I call this running the argument in reverse, right? So remember, the argument is basically, look, here are these 4 claims. They're kind of in tension. One of them needs to go, right? So I said, well, you could kick out NBW. Another way, though, is to say, look, I'm going to keep that one. I'm going to grant that there's no best of all possible worlds. So then the tension becomes, which of the other 3 claims is going to go? Right? So one thing you could do is you could sort of put all your weight on G. G is the claim that God is possible. And you could say, you know what, I think that one is better supported than these other intuitions, these sort of intuitions about morality or rationality, about the goodness of outcomes and actions and agents, right? They seem plausible maybe when I set them out, but maybe G is even more plausible. So again, you could do that in 2 ways, I think. The negative case here, this is maybe a little bit off point, but you might say, look, I want to show that the claim that God is possible has a lot going for it. I want to put weights, as it were, behind that claim in order to then resist the other 2. So one way I could do that is by sort of surveying. There's a bunch of arguments for the impossibility of God, and maybe you're going to argue that they fail. Right? So maybe if you say, look, there are 7 arguments for the impossibility of God, right? Arguments that 2 attributes of God's are incompatible with each other, so therefore God's impossible, those kind of arguments. You could say, look, I'm just picking a number. There's 7, major arguments for the impossibility of God out there. If I can defeat those, maybe that gives me a kind of presumption that God is possible. That would still be, I think, a fairly weak response because, after all, in a way, that's avoiding the issue of this argument here, right? It's a bit like the critic's going to say, well, why are we talking about these other arguments? What we're talking about here is whether this argument shows that God is impossible. In any case, that's one thing you could do. It would be at best a partial case, right? So then the positive way to argue for the possibility of God, I was thinking about different ways you could do this. One way is sort of trivial and won't be relevant here, won't have, how can I put it, won't have much dialectical impact. Suppose you could prove that God exists. So you argue that God actually exists. Well, possibility follows from actuality, right? If I'm actually wearing a blue shirt, then it's possible that I'd be wearing a blue shirt, right? So if you can show that God exists, then a fortiori, as philosophers will say, you've shown that God is possible. So that helps. On the other hand, that's a bit of a strange move, because if you already had an argument for God's existence in your back pocket, right, why would you be worried about this argument for atheism? Okay. So a second strategy, that's B here, is to say, well, maybe the claim that God is possible is some sort of properly basic belief, right? In other words, it's rational for me to believe it, even though I don't have evidence or arguments for it. Sort of an Alvin Plantinga style move. It's a little strange to put a belief like this in the properly basic category. It doesn't really work with the way Plantinga discussed properly basic beliefs. So I think the more common or the more plausible way to go here is to say, look, I'm going to infer God's possibility from the conceivability of God. So there's a big literature on this too, right? If some state of affairs is conceivable, does that give us some reason, good reason, compelling reason, definitive reason to conclude that the state of affairs is possible? Maybe there's a gap, right, between conceivability and possibility. So going that route is going to be tricky as well. You've got to show that your conceivings are reliable indicators in this domain of possibility claims. And that's, to say the least, is going to be very controversial. So I'm a little down on this strategy as a way for the theist to respond to this argument. So, and to interrupt away if you have questions or comments about any of this.
Yeah. So far, crystal clear.
Okay,
Those
good.
were the two responses. Now let's move to number 3.
Yeah, so the third one is, by contrast, very concessive, right? So this is to say, look, this argument, compellingly demonstrates that there's a problem with this conception of God, but I want to remain a theist. So what I want to do then is modify my conception of God, right? So you can say, look, the problem that what generates this problem is to think of God in this incredibly high sense as unsurpassably good and unsurpassably rational and so forth, right? Maybe if we dial that down a little bit, then we don't have a problem anymore. Now that's going to strike some people as impious and heretical and all sorts of other things, right? But it's a strategy that at least has been gestured at. I mean, one thing you could say that might preserve a certain kind of orthodoxy would be this. You might say, look, God isn't surpassable by anything other than God, but God could surpass God. God could do better than God did, right? If the worry is that somebody else is going to be, better, more powerful, or whatever than God, you might say, no, that I'm going to rule that out, but I'm going to concede that God could do better than God does, right? I think for a lot of theists, that's still going to be a bridge too far, too big of a pill to swallow, if I can mix my metaphors, right? But of course, it's a move you could do, right? For any argument against God's existence, if that argument turns on a certain attribute or conception, you could weaken, modify, or eliminate the sticking points in that conception of God.
Okay. So now let's move on to the final two, and these will take a little more time to unpack.
That's right.
So the fourth response is to reject P2. So why don't you
Yeah.
explain that?
And I bet you some people listening or watching this might have felt that way. They might have said right away, "Oh no, P2 or P1, those are the claims that I'm going to go after. It just doesn't seem reasonable to me," right? So just a quick reminder, right? P2 seeks to draw this connection between the possibility of an act being better and the possibility of an agent being better. If it's possible for an act to have been better, then all else equal, it's possible for that actor to have been better. So that's P2, right? So it's been criticized in a few ways. I thought I'd just pull out one by William Hasker that I think fails. So here's what Hasker does. He wants to draw an analogy with an absurd or unreasonable criticism of God on this no best world scenario. And it's a criticism, it's a point I actually mentioned earlier, right? So do you remember I said, look, if there's no greatest positive integer, then it's unreasonable to demand that God pick the greatest possible integer. Similarly, if there's no best of all possible worlds, it's unreasonable to demand that God actualize the best of all possible worlds. Okay. So that's what I mean by the stuff in blue, or that's what Hasker means by the stuff in blue at the top, right? If there's no best world, then this line in blue here is clearly not a failing, right? Failing to do the best you can is not a moral or rational failing if there's no such thing to be done. There's no such thing as the best world actualizing action, right? Um, so Hasker, so that seems uncontroversial. So then he says, by parity of reasoning, right, by thinking through it in the same way, this next thing in blue isn't a fault either. So here's the claim, right? Failing to do better than you did. Okay. And I think what Hasker has in mind here is the idea that, no matter what you do on NBW, you're going to fail to have done something better that you could have done, right? It's sort of the structural feature, right? And so to put it in a slogan, this is actually William Wainwright's phrase here, but the idea I think that Hasker's appealing to here is that a complaint that is always in place is never in place, right? There's something illegitimate about this complaint because no matter what God does, God is going to be susceptible to the complaint that God could have done better. And because that's an unavoidable, a structural feature of the situation, it should not be deemed a fault or a failure or a deficiency in God. Okay, so for my money, this fails. It's very tempting, but I think it fails because I think the cases are different here, right? The problem with the first scenario, demand that God does the best that God can, the problem with that is that that's demanding the logically impossible, right? It's like asking God, as I said, to pick the greatest prime number or the greatest positive integer or something like that. There's no task to perform, right? But doing better than you did, well, that's a logically possible task. It's like by definition in this scenario or in the setup, that's a logically possible task. It's always logically possible for God to have done better with respect to world actualization. So it's not so clear that the intuition transfer, to me anyway, it's not so clear that the intuition from the former case, that that's somehow demanding the absurd of God, which it is, transfers to the latter case, precisely because in the latter case, there's always something more that God could do. There's always something better that God can do. And so to insist that that counts against the moral or rational intuition, I think subtly presupposes that God is possible. And I don't think you can presuppose that God is possible in the context of a debate that is seeking to, or a context of an argument that is seeking to demonstrate that God is impossible. So I think at the end of the day, this actually begs the question. Or at any rate, principled reasons are needed for thinking that the structural feature, the structural problem, God always could have done better. Positive reasons are needed for thinking that that counts against principle P2 and not against the possibility of God.
All right. Well, let's move on then to the fifth response that a theist can offer.
Yeah.
And
So this, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, you're gonna have to tease this one apart. It can go some different routes, right? So you're gonna take us each direction.
This one's right. So I'll do a few different versions of it. This first model is really interesting and quite straightforward. And there's actually quite a literature on this. And I'm certainly not going to try to summarize it all. But here's the idea. Maybe God could just pick a world randomly, right? So in an important and influential and super innovative paper, Daniel and Francis Howard Snyder offered what I'm going to call this recipe. Okay, and I've got a little picture of it over on the right-hand side there, right? So on the right-hand side, you've got all these worlds, right? Each one of these is a world, and they go up to infinity, right? There's no best of all possible worlds. And here's their model. They want to say, look, the first thing that God does is God divides that set of worlds into those that are, quote, acceptable and those that are, quote, unacceptable. And they offer a bunch of suggestions of what that might amount to. Maybe, I forget exactly what they say, but maybe acceptable worlds, a world can only be acceptable if no beings suffer gratuitously, or if everyone's life is redeemed in the end, or whatever criteria you like. Okay, they're God's criteria, so they're going to be really, really good criteria, right? So that's a bit like drawing a line, as I've done here in the little diagram, right? So now we've sorted the sheep from the goats, the acceptable worlds from the unacceptable worlds. And then they say, well, look, what would be the problem with doing this? They have a more intricate argument, but the gist of it is this. What would be the problem with God picking a world at random? How would God be deficient for selecting randomly from the set or the subset, if you will, of acceptable worlds. They're all acceptable by definition. So what would be the problem, right? Of course, God can't pick the best because there is no best. We've hashed that out already, right? So God would just pick at random, right? If somebody offers you, says, look, I'm going to, a wealthy uncle a very wealthy uncle says, I'm going to give you some money and you just got to pick a positive integer and I'm going to give you that many dollars with no upper bound. What would be so crazy about just picking a number randomly? You're going to pick a really large number. Maybe the acceptable numbers or number of dollars for you is very high. It starts at, 10 billion and it goes up from there. Okay, fine. So you randomly pick a number above 10 billion. How does that count against your rationality in the inheritance scenario? That's not their example, but you get the gist of it. In this model, how does it count against God's morality or rationality if God picks at random? Okay, well, so there's a literature on it, and there's really interesting. There's all these different models of what God could do, and there's all these different gods. There's Jove, and there's Thor, and there's Juno in the literature, who are offered as rivals, and different stories are told about them. But here's the nub of it for me, right? I'm not sure that it's coherent, or at least it needs a lot more argument to say that there's one best partition point, right? I mean, I just sort of drew this line over here on the right, but here's what Rose says about it. Rose says, okay, let's suppose that. And let's suppose that God picks the worst of the acceptable worlds. Rowe basically says that doesn't sound very impressive, does it? You'd expect God to pick something far better than the worst, the least good of the acceptable ones, right? Well, that's really a way of getting at the idea that maybe it doesn't make any sense to say there's a unique best partition point. I mean, the intuitions that motivate no best world as a model surely also can be harnessed in support of the claim that for any partition point you or I or God comes up with, there could be a higher standard, a better partition point, right? So I worry about the stipulation that there could be or that there is a unique best partition point. It seems like if you're already on board with the no best world story, why would you suddenly think that there's a unique best partition point? So that's my problem with point A here. And then point B, randomizing as a way of solving a problem seems pretty reasonable, right? In a human case, right? If I had an uncle that wealthy, I'd probably do it too. But look, suppose I said to my wife, hey, listen, my wealthy uncle's going to give us all this money. And here's the number I've come up with by using a random number generator. She might say, that's pretty good. But what if we take the output of your random number generator and multiply it by 2? I'd say, gosh, you know what? Your number's better. I think we should ask for that amount from the wealthy uncle. Let's presume all we care about is money, right? And then I think about it for a night or two, and I say, well, dear, your decision procedure is pretty good, but it occurred to me in the middle of the night that maybe we could take that random number generator and instead of multiplying it by 2, you can see where this is going. I could multiply it by 7, or by some vastly greater number. In other words, just saying God could pick a world at random, it's not obvious that that's the best thing that God could do, that that's the best decision procedure, because obviously for any random output, you could gussy up some twist on it that outputs a better number, a better world, right? Ad infinitum, and then you're right back where you started. So I'm not sure that random selection is the way for the theist to get out of this problem.
All right, so that's the first version of this type of response. But just to be clear, this final response is focusing on P1.
Yes.
So the previous response focuses on objecting to P2, but now we're objecting to P1, and this is just one way you could do that. But here's another way that you could do it. You could do it.
Yeah.
And you can take that one.
Yeah, good. So and yeah, thanks for reminding me. I should have unpacked that further, right? So just to remind everyone, P2 is the proposition that seeks to link the goodness of the outcome with the goodness of the act. So when the Howard Snyder said, hey, God could pick randomly, they're saying, yes, of course, God could get a better outcome, but that doesn't mean that God could have done a better action. And I guess one other point I should make is by God's action in actualizing a world, of course, that's really shorthand for all of the actions and refrainings that are involved in making the world go this way rather than that way, as I said at the start. Okay, so in a way, the Howard Snyder's view is really a tacit appeal to something called satisficing, to say that God just needs to pick a good enough world, because of course God can't pick the best of all possible worlds. So in a way, I distinguished this second 5B as and called that one satisficing. Really, the Howard Snyder's one is satisficing as well. But anyway, let me tell people a little bit about what satisficing is. So a Nobel Prize-winning economist named Herbert Simon came up with this portmanteau. It's a made-up word, right? It's a combination of satisfy and suffice, right? And he was thinking of this. So let me just set it up a little bit with ordinary agents and ordinary decision situations, right? So, you and I, Jordan, we're pretty limited. We don't have the ability to identify all the possibilities that are around us when we're choosing. We don't have the ability to identify the probability of this event happening versus that event happening terribly well. And we certainly don't have the ability to comparatively evaluate all the values of all the different things that might happen, right? We're bounded. We're limited, ordinary human agents, right? So look, when you're choosing a house, or I'll be a little cheeky, if you're choosing a spouse or a house, it's not as though you really, in order to be rational, it's not as though you need to identify every possible item, every possible house, or every possible spouse. It's not as though you really need to be able to evaluate all the different scenarios to a super precise degree in order to be rational. So he was pushing back against these optimizing models of rationality that required for rationality that you be able to kind of see the best and do the best and do all this stuff that we just can't do, right? If you buy a house, even though you could have bought a better house given your budget and priorities and whatever, it's just not clear that you're irrational, right? You can make a rational housing decision by picking a house or a spouse that's good enough, right? That is satisfactory, even though it could have been better. It doesn't make you irrational, right? And that seems entirely plausible as I say here in the slide, right? That seems pretty plausible in certain human choice situations, right? One more example from the literature, Robert Adams says, look, suppose you want to be an animal breeder and you decide to breed goldfish. And maybe horses or ostriches are more excellent beings, and maybe you have the capacity to breed horses or ostriches instead of goldfish. But it's not clear that you're irrational for choosing to do this thing instead of that thing. You're breeding a kind of being that's good enough, right? You can buy a house that's good enough. It doesn't count against your rationality if you didn't do this stuff that's basically impossible for most of us to do most of the time anyway. Okay, so satisficing means choosing an option that's good enough, even though you could have chosen better. In certain stricter contexts, even though you're aware that there are better options, you chose one that's good enough, and that's perfectly fine, right? Well, you can see the motivation, right? Why people would want to apply this model to God as well. Maybe God can satisfy us. Maybe God can pick a world that's good enough, right? And that's, I think, a super compelling intuition. I think a lot of people in philosophy of religion who've thought about this stuff think that some version of this has just got to be right, that it's okay for God to pick a good enough world. It's not okay for God to pick a terrible world, but if God picks a world that's good enough, well, that doesn't count against God's rationality or goodness. Okay, so I have some worries about this, right? I mean, the first thing to note is that although I said it's plausible, there actually is some controversy in the ethics and decision theory literature about this in human cases, even in idealized cases, right? So here's a lovely example. Suppose you're a wine lover. This is from John Pollock. Suppose you're a wine lover and oenophile, and I give you a bottle of this very special wine called Ever Better Wine. And unlike most wine, which kind of gets better for a while and then gets worse, as the name suggests, ever better wine just gets better and better and better and better. And now we'll add one other point. Suppose you're an immortal oenophile. So you're never going to be too old to enjoy it or taste it. You're never going to run out of days of life to enjoy it or taste it. When should you drink the wine? Well, satisficers say, look, you pick a day that's good enough on which the wine is good enough, right? But this is contested in the literature, right? Some people say that this just shows that you can't be a fully rational wine lover in this scenario, right? So it's controversial. Now, Turning to the divine case, and this is really where my worries sort of get more serious, right? This whole model of satisficing was devised, as I explained, for ordinary, boundedly rational, limited human agents like me or you. It wasn't built, the model wasn't built for God, right? Um, and part of the thing with satisficing is that it's meant to allow for an action to be rationally or morally permissible while granting that you could have done better. While granting, so when you might say, choosing this house or this spouse or this animal to breed or this day to drink the wine, choosing it doesn't make you morally or rationally blameworthy, but you could have done better. See, I worry about transferring that to God. I mean, suppose you just do, right? You say, okay, fine. So God is not morally or rationally blameworthy for picking a world that's this good. What about the other part of it? God could have done better. That's the part that presents a problem for this model of essential divine unsurpassability. If you're really serious about God being essentially unsurpassable, then you want to resist the idea that God could have done better, right? And it's very tempting, I think, to just assume that God is possible here and say, well, look, if I were God and I were in that situation, I would just pick a really good world, right? But you can't assume that God is possible. This is an argument that is meant to demonstrate that God is impossible. So relying on satisficing that was built for a different context for how agents can be rational in imperfect knowledge environments, all that stuff doesn't apply to God. Um, for me, the bottom line is this, right? Even if you say that God wouldn't be blameworthy morally or rationally, as soon as you concede that God could have done better, there's going to be some pull, I think, on the intuition that God would have therefore performed a better action. And that's what motivates P1. So I'm not sure that all this stuff can successfully undermine P1.
All right, so now we're going to go to the final version of this response.
Yeah, so in a recent paper, a terrific philosopher named Chris Tucker from William and Mary University argued against me and others that this debate isn't really about divine satisficing, it's about something else, which he called motivated sub-maximization. So I'll set up his definition, I'll try to give an example, and then I'll explain why I think that doesn't work in the divine case either. So here it is. So an agent sub-maximizes in a motivated way, in a transparent situation, a situation where the agent knows what all the options are and so forth, when the following two conditions are satisfied. A wants to get as much of a certain good as that being can. That's what Tucker says. But secondly, A chooses a suboptimal option because of some really good reason, a countervailing consideration. I'm going to explain that. So imagine that's my picture of a film festival here. This isn't Tucker's analogy, but I think it's useful. Suppose you're a film buff. We've gone from being a wine buff to a film buff. Suppose you're a film buff, and you're going to attend the Toronto International Film Festival, and you love seeing great movies, and you want to get the most high quality aesthetic film going experiences that you can. Okay, so that's condition one. You aim to get as much of this good, whatever this good is, aesthetic quality, as you can. But you've got some independent reason that prompts you in a different way. Maybe you've got a friend and you're really loyal to this friend and you always have a lot of fun with this friend when you go to movies. And this friend really wants you to see a movie on the program that's really not very well reviewed. It's a cheesy action movie or a schmaltzy Western or whatever you like, right? It's obviously not a very good movie, right? But you've got this other consideration, your loyalty to your friend, your companionship, the fun you're going to have, right? So yes, on the whole, for this festival, you want to get as much aesthetic pleasure as you can, and you're going to miss out on this really terrific movie by going to this cheesy movie or whatever with your friend. But you've got a countervailing consideration, a reason that is independent of the caliber of the movie. It has to do with the goods of friendship, that justifies you in choosing a suboptimal option, in getting less of this overall aesthetic value than you clearly could have gotten. And you do it in full knowledge, and it's perfectly fine, right? Because you have this independent countervailing consideration. Your loyalty to your friend, the goodness of friendship, however you want to tell that story. So an important thing here, two important points about this. The countervailing consideration is supposed to be independent, right? So the good, this good G in this case, is the, whatever you want to call it, the aesthetic pleasure of getting the most aesthetic enjoyment from the film going experience as you can. But then you've got this independent factor, the independent factor of loyalty to your friend or the goods of friendship or whatever, right? And that cuts against or counts against or countervails, to use the technical term, this desire to get as much of the good as you can. Okay, the second point I want to make is that a consideration, I think, for Tucker is only countervailing. It only countervails when it really countervails. In other words, it's a success term. In other words, in the case of the film festival example, it's only really a countervailing consideration if it makes you rational in giving up some of the aesthetic goodness that you might have gotten. And of course, we want to say it's totally rational to do that, right? You're not rationally blameworthy for sacrificing some of this good that you care so much about for the sake of this other good. It's perfectly fine, right? So it's a success term. A consideration only really countervails when it secures your rationality. Okay? Okay. So then here in a nutshell, I've sort of gone back and forth with Tucker a little bit, but here in a nutshell are my objections to this, to the deployment of this concept to the divine case. First one, it's sort of a smaller objection, but look, God surely wouldn't have the aim that you see in letter number 1 there, right? God wouldn't aim to get as much of the good as God can. Let's talk about the world actualizing scenario. That would be an irrational thing for God to do. That would be God thinking like, oh, I'm really going to make the best of all possible worlds, actualize it. But God knows there's no such thing, right? So it would be irrational to aim at something that one knows to be impossible, right? It would be irrational for me to aim to construct a 4-sided triangle later on this evening when I'm fully aware that constructing a 4-sided triangle is an impossible thing to do, right? So describing God's aim in that way doesn't seem quite right. But my more serious objection is this. Tucker's countervailing consideration, I haven't told you what it is yet, it's this. It's that there's no best of all possible worlds. So the scenario is supposed to be this. God aims to do the best, to get as much of this good as God can, but that seems irrational. And then the supposedly independent countervailing consideration is this fact that there's no best of all possible worlds. So I'm puzzled by this. First of all, that doesn't seem independent. It seems like the very issue that we were talking about, right? Remember, in the film festival case, we had the aesthetic goodness that you're going to get from going to the Toronto Film Festival for 2 weeks, and then you've got the independent goods of friendship that cuts against that, right? Well, over here, you're trying to get as much good as you can, supposedly, but there's no such thing as the best, as the greatest good that you can get in world actualizing. It doesn't seem like the same thing. It doesn't seem like an independent consideration to me. But that's not even my biggest worry. My biggest worry here is this. It's that, as I said, a countervailing consideration, that term seems to me like a success term. In other words, Tucker is thinking that realizing that there's no best of all possible worlds automatically makes it rational or moral or perfectly acceptable for God to just pick one that's good enough. But I think that way of talking subtly begs the question, because I think that way of talking assumes rather than proves that it's possible that God exists in this scenario. In other words, you say to yourself, well, look, there's no best of all possible worlds, so I'm just going to pick one. That way of talking already makes it sound like you've assumed that there could be an agent in that predicament. What kind of agent? An essentially unsurpassable agent, an agent who's unsurpassable in morality, in goodness and rationality and so forth. But that's the very point that's under dispute. So I don't think you get to claim that realizing there's no best of all possible worlds is a countervailing consideration without more argument. I mean, maybe it is at the end of the day. I'm not saying that this will never work, but I think it's very easy to come awfully close to begging the question here, to subtly assume that God is possible and in this bind, and then just says, fine, I'm going to pick one. But you can't assume that, because this argument is trying to show precisely that that scenario is impossible.
All right. So those were the 5 responses. So just to sum it up, the first response is you deny that there is there is no best possible
Right.
world. You deny that. The second response is you say, okay, I grant, yep, you can do that, but I uh, I have I how can I say it?
I have
That
more
G,
reason. I have more reason for thinking
yes,
that
yeah,
God is
yeah, yeah.
possible.
I have
Yeah,
more reason to accept G than P1 or P2.
that's
So
right.
something's got to be wrong with P1 or P2.
And I'm in my rights to stick with G because here are my arguments for it. Yep.
Yeah. The third response was, let's see, I forgot. The third response was, yes, you can modify G. that gets a little tricky. Uh, but you can do that. Okay. So then the fourth response then is you deny P2. And then the fifth, there were 3 versions of it, and all of them tried to reject P1 for
That's
one
right.
reason or another.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll close this out here. What would you like to say to summarize our discussion?
Well, what I would say is that I would encourage people who are interested in this topic to really look further at these arguments. I mean, I think I really do. I think that this argument gets dismissed a little bit too readily, right? I'm inclined to think that this argument fails as well, but I'm really not sure what the best strategy is to defeat it. And look, I've indirectly defended this argument in print by criticizing its critics, right? I think that in a few places its critics, for example, beg the question, right? So I do want to encourage philosophers, particular theistic philosophers who are interested in this topic, to really try to come up with better arguments, better responses to this argument, or to develop one of these responses, of course, in a more compelling way, because I'm not sure that that's been done to date.
All right, before we go, let me ask you this. So we've done an interview called Why Theists Should Believe There's a Multiverse.
Yeah,
And there was a trilemma that we presented in that one. And 2 of the horns were one horn says, okay, there is a best possible world. A second horn says there's no best possible world. And the third one was there's an equal tie at the
that's right.
top.
That's right.
Many possible worlds are all equally tied at the top. So those were the 3. Now we didn't get into that third option in this interview, but if I understood our discussion then, it seems like what you defended there would be the first response. You would
Yes, that's
reject
exactly right.
that you would say there is no best possible world.
That's
So that would
exactly right.
automatically land you. You got to either say there is a best possible world or there are many best possible worlds. They're all equally tied.
That's right.
But what you want to say, or what you defended in that uh, interview, was you said there's this one best possible world,
Yeah.
but that best possible world is a multiverse.
Exactly. And the thought is that that's going to help to defang some of the problems that I talked about, right? Certainly modal collapse and some of the other ones. Yeah. So that's the move that I've defended in print. But nothing comes for free in philosophy, as I probably said in that interview as well, right? There are lots of objections to that model of divine world actualization as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And you present those objections as well at the end.
Yeah.
So I hope the viewers appreciate just the intellectual honesty of it. You want to acknowledge when there are challenges to your argument, even when, in this case, you look and you say, I don't really want this argument to work, but nevertheless, if it's defended well and we don't have good responses to it, then that's we acknowledge that we
That's right.
recognize that situation.
Good
So
philosophers should follow the arguments where they lead. Absolutely.
yeah. All right. Well, if the viewers are interested in checking out that interview I just mentioned, you can see it. It's pretty recent. Like I said, I think it's called "Why Theists Should Believe in the Multiverse," something like that.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kraay, for joining me, and I really enjoyed it.
It was a real pleasure again, Jordan. Thanks so much.
All right. We'll see you next time.